Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of the Phil Taitt Show. Howie Greene is known as the man behind the brand. He is best known for managing the late, great Mr. James Brown, who was known for hits such as Get Up Off That Thing and This Is a Man's World. Today I sit down with Howie, not only to discuss his illustrious career managing Mr. Brown, but also the transition to now managing a classroom and his current career as a college professor. Just to fill some of you all in, this is our second time trying to sit down with Howie. Those of you who follow us on our Instagram pages, you might have seen that we were outside with Howie and his beautiful dog, co-star Sunshine. Although Sunshine was on set with us that day, we didn't have any sunshine in the sky. The clouds were out, the wind was whipping, and the rain was pouring. So we learned our lessons, and we're indoor and it's dry. Let's try this again. Part 2 with Mr. Howie Greene. So let's get right into the interview. As we know, you were the former manager of Mr. Brown, and he's done so many great things in his career. Before you started to manage Mr. Brown, were you actually a fan of him?
Well, let's clarify one thing. I was part of a management team, so I wasn't his only manager. We had 3 managers at the time, and you can walk down any street. You can walk down Geralman Street here in Brooklyn by St. Francis College. I probably meet 3 people who claim to have managed him at some point in his career. But I did actually manage him towards the end of his life, and I was part of a management team. I was more of the day-to-day guy. But your original question was a James Brown fan, and the answer is yes. When I was growing up on East 28th Street here in Brooklyn, for people watching around the world, it's a part of Flatbush section of Brooklyn, I was the guy on the street listening to the black radio station. I was listening back then to WBLS. And for some reason, I had soul music inside of me, and I never really understood why. I just did. I used to sneak down in late 70s, and then it started getting a little dangerous during the crack era in the 80s. But I used to sneak up to Harlem all the time just to walk the streets and never really knew why. And in 1980 was the first time I got to see James Brown perform live at the old Studio 54, the famous disco here in New York. A couple of my friends of mine worked there and snuck me in. Actually, didn't sneak me in. They brought me through the front door. And I got to see him up close and personal, and I thought, that man must be on roller skates, because I don't know how anybody could dance like that. And little did I know that 20 years later, 30 years later, I would be working with him. And I think all of those things that happened to me as a young boy were kind of sending me a message later on that I was going to be around this greatness.
I mean, to me, that's just mind-boggling. What was it like?
Me too.
what was it like being in that a part of that audience that night when you saw him? What was it like? Electricity in there?
Well, yeah, it was crazy because remember it was 1980 and people were doing a lot of cocaine back then. They were doing quaaludes. A lot of people were drinking and driving. There was a lot of rules back then, and I was actually standing next to Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones and John Belushi. They happened to be standing right next to me. And
crazy.
it was crazy because Mr. Brown was in not the funkiest time of his career, but a funky time of his career, where disco was really big, and a lot of the artists like James Brown from that era really suffered during the disco era because the DJ was king, not even queen yet. I don't think there were any female DJs yet, so the DJ was king, and live music, especially soul music and funk, was on the wane. So it was kind of an interesting type of crowd. They were actually watching. They knew what they were watching, but I wouldn't say there were actual James Brown fans in the room. It was more of a happening. It was something to be around.
Well, just tell me, how did you saw this person and years before you even got to know Mr. Brown? Mm-hmm. How did you get connected to being a part of this team to manage Mr. Brown?
Well, what happened was I was working in radio at the time and getting fired, and working in radio and getting fired. The radio industry at that time in the mid to late 90s was really turning over quickly. Radio stations were being sold. Consolidation was really big. So I was out of work a lot. I was on air talent. I wasn't management, so I was out of work a lot. And a mutual friend, a friend of mine, we have a mutual friend who was taking on the management of James Brown, and said, you need Howie Greene. And he's like, you mean the radio guy? I said, yeah, he's like a James Brown freak, and you're going to need a day-to-day guy. So he flew in on his private plane, this guy that I worked for, and when I was living in Denver at the time. We met, and the next thing I knew, there I was in New York, waiting for James Brown to come off a private airplane at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey to go do the Video Music Awards, the MTV Video Music Awards.
What was it like when you saw James Brown for the first time?
I went into, I went into work mode. So I really didn't have time to digest it. It took me a little while to digest it. I literally had like $5 in my pocket because I was out of work, and I put all the money I had to get to New York. But the first time that I actually met him was at Teterboro Airport coming off the plane, and Eminem was coming off of his own plane at the same time. Yeah. So somebody clued Marshall Mathers into the fact that I was one of James Brown's managers, and he actually came over and begged me if he could meet James. And I said, well, first thing is we call him Mr. Brown, not James. That's number one. And I said, and number two, I said, my stepson's a big fan of yours, so maybe if you have a CD, you could sign for him.
It was a win-win.
I'll make it happen. So next thing I know, Eminem's going like this to one of his people, and they come over and he's signed that. Next thing he's meeting James Brown before I met him.
I told you, for those of you who've never seen this man, that you're going to see something special.
About your past.
Mr. Brown's impact on music has been so severe. An impact that it will last forever. That even someone like Eminem, who's kind of made it in his own right, is still such a fan to see someone like Mr. Brown.
Well, he's an icon and a legend, and he still is, even though he's been gone for so many years. Although it seems like yesterday, he's still such an icon and a legend to those in the music business. I've seen some crazy things. I saw, what do we call him Puffy these days? We call him Diddy, P. Diddy, Puff, Sean,
Combs.
Mr. Combs. I saw him cry when Mr. Brown came out of the limo to do rehearsal for the VMAs. We kind of surprised Puffy. I think he was Puffy back then. We surprised him back then, because he used to stand outside of James Brown's house when he lived in St. Albans, Queens, trying to meet him.
A part of all the things that Mr. Brown did in his career, he also came back to Harlem, where it all began, to do 2 shows at the Apollo.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What made him want to come back to Harlem to do 2 shows?
I really had two goals of mine, personal goals. One was to get James Brown a Kennedy Center honor, because it's hard to believe he didn't have a Kennedy Center honor. And I did achieve that. That was the last thing I got to do for him while managing him. And the other thing was I wanted to bring him back to the Apollo, big time, just like he used to do back, 1964.
And he did 2 sold-out shows.
Did 2 sold-out shows at the Apollo, which he hadn't done since back in the day. And we made it big, and there were a lot of stars there. Dan Aykroyd came and danced on stage with him and did Soul Man with him. And it was amazing. And what we did when we announced the shows, was we did a free show out in front of the Harlem State Office Building by the Adam Clayton Powell statue. And we set up a stage, and it was only supposed to be a little 15-minute performance. And before he got there, it was like, must have been a tornado out there on 125th Street. The winds were howling, and it was raining, and like, well, no way we're going to be able to do this. And here comes James Brown's limo, and he gets out of the limo, and the skies open up, and it's a beautiful day. And he performed actually for an hour and 15 minutes.
And he was only supposed to be there for 15 minutes.
But there's no such thing. Now when it comes to James Brown, there's no such thing. And it was amazing. I mean, he was out there singing and dancing, and people, back then, it wasn't that long ago, but they hadn't done all that development on 125th Street yet, so there was still a lot of those, old tenements that were up across the street. People were hanging out the windows, and they were dancing and singing and screaming, James, James, I love you. Walking down 125th Street with him was like, I don't know, it must have been like, in the Bible walking around with Jesus, because people would they just fall at his feet, literally fall at his feet, and you'd meet people who'd be crying because he got them through some horrible, horrible times, through the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s, and they were so excited just to see him and touch him. And he would have time for everybody. He would stop and he would talk to everybody. He'd go into the stores and spend money in the stores, even stuff that he didn't need. He might not even buy anything and give him money.
I think that's great. Recently, Jennifer Lopez just did a huge concert in Castle Hills for the Bronx, where she first came from, and she didn't charge anybody. It was a free concert, and I think that's what you hit on was such an important part.
She cost me 3.5 hours in traffic sitting because it cost somebody something. Thanks, J-Lo. Did you watch this?
No, she's not going to watch this. So what inspired you to leave the managing field and now go into teaching college students, of all people, I'm a college student, about speech?
Well, it didn't happen just like that. I remember when James Brown passed away, and his first funeral, he had 3 funerals. The first one was at the Apollo.
Very grand.
Yeah, the first one was at the Apollo. And I went there and went to see his body. And when I looked down in the coffin, he was sweating. He was actually sweating. And I looked at my wife and I said, I'm done. I'm done with show business. I'm done. I don't need to do anything else in show business.
Really?
That's it. And I did work, at the time I was working for Sirius Satellite Radio. Now it's Sirius XM as an executive producer. And I did do that. But I decided I wanted to start doing some other things. I was reaching a certain age where, show business is not very stable. So
yeah, ripping and running.
Yeah, so I decided to go out and get my real estate license, and I did that. And then I decided to go back to my old college, Kingsborough Community College, where it all started, and I wanted to teach broadcasting. That's what I took there. So I hooked up with my mentor, Dr. Cliff Hesse, who's still there, and told him I wanted to teach. And it took a while till I got into the college. And they gave me one class, and then they gave me two classes, and then they asked me, I was teaching Introduction to Mass Media, and then they asked me if I would teach a public speaking course. Yeah. It turned out that I loved it because I love that you could see immediate results. Unlike other classes, it takes time to really see the results of your labor. But in public speaking, you could see people in the course of 13 weeks really change how they communicate. So it's not that far of a leap.
So we know that Mr. Brown had passed away. His movie's about to come out. What do you think about that?
Listen, I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be great. I think a lot of his story is going to be told. Everything's going to be told, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He was certainly no saint. He was certainly no angel. He was a very complicated man. I'm excited to see it.
I mean, I'm excited to see it too. I think it's going to be a great thriller story, great music, great acting. It's going to show his story, and I think that it's also going to preserve his legacy. I think that he's left enough music to preserve his legacy on his own right. But do you think that this is another great avenue to educate another generation?
Yeah, I'm hoping for a couple of things here. I'm hoping that it will regenerate interest in James Brown, and not only his music, but his life and what he went through, and the story that he left behind, the model of how you can be successful no matter where you come from, that in this country you still have a chance to make it if you work hard.
It's true.
And you believe in yourself, and you channel that anger, and you channel that bitterness. There was a man with a 7th grade education. There was a man who used to be locked up in a shack every day by his father when his father went out to strip turpentine, or the stuff that would become turpentine off of trees, and his mother ran away from home, and he was left on his own. And he went to school wearing hand-me-downs. That's the reason why he was so big on the way you dress, because he had to go to school wearing hand-me-downs. And they made him, in Augusta, Georgia, they asked him to leave school because his clothes weren't good enough to go to school. So he was raised by one of his aunts in a whorehouse in Augusta, and this was his upbringing. And he was able to become one of the largest superstars in American history. So I'm hoping this movie will regenerate not only his music, but his story. And the other thing I'm hoping for is that this will generate some interest in his band. Because not only was James Brown a great musician and a great composer and a great singer and a great dancer and a great everything, he was also one of this nation's greatest band leaders. And I don't think he's been given his due yet.
Howie, let me not say Howie, I want to say Mr. Greene.
Thank you, Mr. Taitt.
I really want to just thank you so much for just coming down here to talk about your story and to talk about the legacy of Mr. Brown as well as the time working with him. And from all of us here at the Phil Taitt Show, we'd just like to thank you once again.
Thank you. Okay? Thanks for having me out. I appreciate it. Twice. I've been on twice now.
Well, at least it was 3 times the charms, but I'm happy that we caught it on the second time, you know? Right. Well, that's all for the Phil Taitt Show, family and friends. I'm so happy that I was able to share another great story with you. I'll see you all soon. That's all for the Phil Taitt Show. Peace, love, and harmony.